Thank you very much, Stephanie. Thank you very much, panelists. It was a very interesting first session, which is a lot of challenges was identified, the problem. So we are starting the second session of the webinar. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, scholar friends and students. On behalf of International Institute for Peace, I welcome all of you very warmly to this webinar from a snowing Vienna. One of the main objectives of this webinar is to facilitate the peace process in South Asian region and what role the international community could play. And most important issue, I mean, we discussed a lot of problem in the first session, and what is the way forward for our next future generation. That is very important. And I think with that note, we will start how we can achieve these challenges and convert them into opportunities. The countries of South Asian regions are India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Nepal, Bhutan, the Maldives. The region present, and I call it a vivid tapestry of human diversity in all its glory. Across its 8 countries with all the world religions, live side by side, speaking hundreds of languages, sharing deep culture similarity and celebrating their differences. Yet South Asia has a population of approximately 2 billion, almost 1/3 of the world population live in this region. It has its challenges and issues, which was comprehensively explained in the first session of the webinar. However, I am a strong believer that challenges also bring opportunity if there is a leadership with long-term vision and courage to take unpopular and difficult decisions. In this part of the webinar, as I just said, the discussion will be focused more on solution and way forward. And it is our hope that at the end of the webinar, we may have some concrete step to follow for achieving the peace, prosperity, understanding among the people of the region. As the moderator of the webinar, I would like just to give you some information. The topic, as you know, the role of international community and way forward for future generation. We had 4 reputable, well-known, respected panelists with impressive leadership quality. Unfortunately, the first panelist, His Excellency Sardar Masood Khan, the President of Azad Jammu and Kashmir, just called and apologized because he had to attend an unplanned ad hoc meeting. And he really apologized and regret very deeply that he will not be able to part of that excellent webinar. Without further, I would just request then Professor Dr. Heinz Geithner for his introductory remarks. Just let me introduce Professor GÄRTNER. He has been attached to the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna and the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna and the Danube University. He was an academic director of the Austrian Institute for International Affairs until 2016. He is the editor of the book series Internationale Sicherheit, International Security. Professor also chairs the advisory board of the Strategy and Security of the Austrian Armed Forces, as well as a member of the advisory board of the International Institute for Peace in Vienna, our host organization, and the journal Security, Peace for and the journal Security and Peace. Professor GÄRTNER received the Bruno Kreisky legendary former Austrian Chancellor Award for most outstanding political books. Professor Heinz GÄRTNER, the floor is yours, please. You are unmuted.
Yes, I know. Thank you, RATHOR. Also, I want to thank the International Institute for Peace, which definitely thank Hannes Swoboda for organizing it, but I also want to mention Yasir Khan, who had the idea to this conference. I will start with some general academic observations. We do have a realist school which sees an anarchic world outside. There is no regulatory mechanism above, well, very little regulatory mechanism above the states. The only regulatory mechanisms are balance of power, and in the age of nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence. So in this world, war is always possible. It can be war like it can rain all the time if balance of power and deterrence fails. So that's not the world we want to leave to our next generation. But we do have other concepts out there, and I will go back to the late 50s. The famous political scientist Karl Deutsch already developed the idea of security communities, where states develop some basic common values, and through permanent communication, they can bring these values to a higher level. And the political scientist Hadley Bull from the English school demonstrated how this higher level could work. And he had the idea of the international society. And the international society can be, according to Immanuel Kant, solidarist, or to this philosopher Hugo Grotius, pluralist. So within this general framework, cooperation and multilateralism always could have a place. Unfortunately, we are not living in a Kantian world right now. So what we are facing is increasing polarization, especially when it comes to great power competition. So to some extent, the world is becoming more anarchic, less solidarist, and less multilateral. Just to take an historical worst case analogy, with the end of the 19th century, when we had increasing nationalism, we had arms race, declining multilateralism, the Concert of Vienna was breaking apart, and the depreciation of international law and international institutions. However, having said this, it's possible to have some anarchic-free areas in the world. And the previous session, which was a very rich debate, in the previous session, it was several times mentioned, for example, climate change, where cooperation is possible. With it, also, if we have a great power in the framework of a great power competition. It's even more dangerous, of course, if nuclear weapons are involved in this great power competition. So how can we get to this international security community or international society? I bring a more positive historical analogy in this context, that is the Helsinki Accords of 1975 of the CSC, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. So if you look at the document of the Helsinki Accords, you cannot see any mentioning of enemy, rival, competitor, foe. If you look at today's security strategies, they are full of these expressions. Also, according to this Helsinki Agreement, border changes are possible. Border changes are possible, but they have to be peaceful and based on consensus and international law. A more recent example of an cooperative multilateralism is the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal. I'm mentioning it because just at the moment in Vienna, we have talks how to revive this nuclear deal. For the European Union, the JCPOA was a masterpiece of effective multilateralism. Coming to South Asia, so more regional, it's possible also to have anarchic, free areas even if there are zones of conflicts. So other concepts are international or regional regimes, which could be applied to South Asia, and regimes are defined by common values, norms, principles, and common decision-making procedures. So it can be applied, if not generally, to certain areas. Just for example, looking at South Asia, there can be confidence-building measures in some areas. There can be, like in the Treaty of the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, notification of large military exercises. Also, if you look at nuclear arms trafficking or nuclear material trafficking, there can be developed common rules how to tackle arms, nuclear material trafficking in the area. So we have the choice here today and for the next generation, whether we want to live an anarchic world similar to before 1914, or whether we want to build on the idea of Helsinki of 1975. Thank you, Mr. Azad.
Thank you very much, Professor Geithner. We will go now to our first panelist. This is Mr. Kishore MANDHYAN. He's a political director and deputy director of peacekeeping, human rights and humanitarian affairs in the cabinet of the Secretary General of the United Nations, an ex-colleague of me as well. Welcome, Mr. Kishore. He is presently with the Aam Aadmi Party India, which is a communal party called and has worked on its state advisory council to the Maharashtra State Executive, political education and training committee, and grievance cell on matter related to party organization, manifesto, policy program and election campaign, issues, funding and external relation. Mr. Kishore MANDHYAN, floor is yours, sir. Please unmute.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, good. It's a pleasure to be with the Institute for Peace, and I would like to thank AFSAR for connecting me to the Institute for Peace. I think it's a wonderful institution. I had been there some years ago, and with Bombay completely infested with COVID, I think it's great to be reconnected somewhere else where you might be in a better situation. Dr. Rathor, I think you were kind enough to send me a few pointers within the larger framework that we have for this second panel. And what I will do is I'll make some general points and then go to the specific issues that you asked me to address as we go along. Of course, they will be somewhat general because there is so much to cover, but I hope that in the course of our discussion, we can bring out some of the specifics and have a discussion which is more concrete. But I will flag the main points as we go along. First and foremost, I think the context. If we look back at the last 75 years of South Asia, however you might define it, with 8 powers, with 9 powers, with 7 powers, it's essentially a region which has experienced conflict, broadly speaking. In 1985, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation was established, and there was an attempt to bring the cooperative side of international relations into the paradigm of conflict. Once we look back for 35 years with regard to SAR, I don't think there's much to speak to it. So, and as far as conflict is concerned, I think other speakers have pointed out that we have become increasingly polarized, increasingly militarized. We are also nuclearized, at least 2 of the powers in South Asia. And I don't think this bodes well for stability in the region. There are many reasons for it, and we can discuss that. But the main point here is that there's essentially been continuity rather than change in South Asia over the last 75 years. The second point I'd like to make is to look not at the environment, but the internal conditions of South Asia. If you look at any state, of course, there has been progress in per capita incomes, in GNP, in the Human Development Index, and so on and so forth. But I don't think that much of this progress has percolated to the people at the bottom. And there's a tremendous amount of economic inequality which feeds into the political inequality, even in democratic polities like India, which are becoming quite fragile. So my sense is that neither the external conditions nor the internal conditions are a basis for a dialogue which can lead to fruitful outcomes. And unless the political classes, particularly the elites, recognize this, I doubt very much that we can move forward, because we are caught in a vicious cycle of top-down growth, no bottom-up distribution, and we externalize most of our problems, and I'll come to that as we go along. I now come to the specific 5 pointers that you raised. The first and foremost was in relation to human rights. Again, if we look across the 8 South Asian countries, there are human rights issues of one kind or the other in every country, whether it is child rights, whether it is violence against women, whether it relates to broader issues of free speech and state control of assembly and association coming from the protocols of political rights and civil liberties, or whether it is related to cultural rights, social rights, and economic rights. Once again, the issue of economic democracy as opposed to political democracy comes up. And I don't think we have seriously tried to address rights in both of those channels. And wherever they were addressed, particularly in India, which had moved on, we seem to be witnessing a regression, as most of the people well know, whether it's the rights of journalists, whether it's the rights of minorities, Dalits, and others. So again, that aspect of the South Asian political regime and human rights regime is not going anywhere and has not gone much in the last couple of decades. The second point that you raised is the question of nationalism. How does one address nationalism? Now, that's a complex phenomenon. There are many ways to address it. But if you look at any country which is deeply nationalistic, and South Asia offers various examples of different types of nationalism, but there are 4 or 5 common things. If you have not performed internally well in the country, economically or politically, you try to find a scapegoat outside. You try to find internal enemies. You try to find enemies amongst your neighbors. So, unless and until there is a recognition that you have to address those issues with neighbors, you have to address those issues internally, you are going to become more nationalistic. You are going to fabricate your histories. You are going to, in many ways, look at the past rather than the future. So, South Asia has to confront that. There are, even in India, if you look at the most recent situation with regard to academics, the Ashoka University situation, free speech has come into question. The question of being able to write openly in major newspapers, although it happens, it is still relatively vibrant, but increasingly there is a fragility on that count too. And if that is happening in India, I think we are quite aware of how it operates in even other countries. Though I must say that in India, we were quite proud of it, and we seem to notice a regression over there. The third point is with regard to the question of how, besides nationalism, is the question of, I'm sorry, I got my notes a bit confused over here, is the role of youth. Of course, youth have a very important role to play. All our countries are quite young, but I think they're going to be the most challenged because of the technological change that is ahead of them and the legacies that they have inherited. The legacies of unequal growth, the legacies of poor infrastructure, the legacies of an education system which is highly compromised. At least I can say that for India, except for the elite institutions. So there is a question over here, is unless you are properly informed, unless you are properly trained, what role can you meaningfully play? And this is also true of many of our adults who have become victims of propaganda. So we have an environment which is not particularly propitious to address some of the deep issues that confront us on the borders, which confront us regionally. So, having looked at some of those points, I'd like to conclude my initial remarks by saying what are the constraints and what needs to be done. First and foremost, I think, particularly the elites, we have to start thinking of how are the elites invested in each of their countries. To be honest, most of the elites, their children are abroad in the West. Two, there's a flight of capital going on from most of the countries. Elites are not invested in their own societies. And I don't think that was true of Europe and America or Japan, or for that matter, the Chinese, when they were developing in the way we want to develop the several South Asian countries. The second point is the militarization of the Indian Ocean and the Himalayas. I mean, if there is a guns and butter issue, we seem to be poising ourselves to increasing our military budgets rather than decreasing them, and therefore creating greater inequalities within our countries, and therefore actually exacerbating the conditions for conflict within and its impact outside. My sense is that if you cannot
You're on mute.
Sorry, go ahead, Dr. Rathor. Yeah.
No, it was broken. Your voice.
What I was saying was that if you cannot be internally equal or at least equitable, internally stable, then how can you create a region of stability? And therefore you have to focus on internal development, and not only the hard development, but what I think is soft development, which in fact is much harder than hard development. That is developing the human infrastructure in our societies, health, education, delivery of services. And therefore we have to move away from expanding our budgets to actually diverting those budgets to the development of our societies internally. The other point I would like to raise is creating a domestic consensus. Right now, it is a small section of the political class talking to each other. Now, if you go back to the Schuman Plan in Europe, in the post-Second World War period, there was a virtual consensus amongst the elites of Europe to move towards the European Union, towards the European coal and steel community. I don't think so. There is such a conversation amongst the elites of South Asia. It is purely a state-led movement by particular parties and particular people within parties. I don't think it's broad enough and deep enough. That's the other point I'd like to make. Yet another point I would like to make is that there has to be political will and state capacity. Often politicians agree on a number of things, but is there a capacity, both in terms of resources and a desire to execute plans or agreements which have been made widely and deeply once the bureaucrats and the diplomats return home? This is something which I think we have to think quite deeply about, because the relationship between the bureaucracy and their political bosses in our country are based rather on patronage than on understanding exactly what the broader issues of the country are. And this is something which needs a deeper discussion. I'll leave it at that for the moment. Then there is this third level, besides political will, developing a new narrative, developing state capacity. What I think is the most important side of cooperation and creating a sense of stability amongst South Asians. Who is a South Asian? How do we define a South Asian? Is something which I don't think has really been discussed adequately, in the way one talks about who is an American or who is a European. And therefore, I think that kind of discussion needs to take place. It has so many dimensions to it. So I would say that in this regard, there needs to be deep and wide cultural contact. The South Asian University was created, it hasn't gone anywhere. Youth should be exchanged. Maybe there should be a youth rail pass for South Asian students to travel to each other's country at very low cost. Journalists, particularly from vernacular newspapers, Urdu newspapers, Marathi newspapers, Bengali newspapers, Nepali newspapers, need to meet each other more often. It is mainly the English-speaking journalists who meet more often than anyone else. Number 4, the religious elites need to meet each other. You know, they are the ones who are most captured by the political mobilization of particular political parties and how they perceive each other. I think they need to meet face to face and discuss some of the issues. A forum needs to be created for that. And more importantly, I think people like me, my family came from Sindh, Shikarpur in Pakistan. They were in Karachi, they were in Larkana. There is no forum for us to meet people who left India to Pakistan. You know, I traveled in Pakistan a couple of years ago. It was a beautiful country to travel. But actually the image which exists in the average Indian is based on tremendous amount of propaganda. And I'm sure that this is this might be true on other sides of the barrier. So we need to somehow create forums where many of these prejudices, many of these propaganda dimensions are diluted before, you know, we can really get into a serious discussion of how to move from conflict to cooperation. Let me stop there and we can take the rest in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mandhyan Kishore. Yes, you were here in Vienna on our invitation in May 2018. We had a conference in the Diplomatic Academy. We really enjoyed and benefit from your enriched experience and expertise. You have mentioned several points here. The elites investment, yes. Recently, there was a report issued that $8 trillion is exported every year from the developing countries to the developed world, and most of that money is not legal money. This is the money of the corruption. Your Western countries also have a legal and moral authority here to pact and ask the question, where does money come from? You talk about the militarization and the budget we are spending. Yes, if you check the South Asian region, these 8 countries together, approximately $100 billion each year they invest on their military, whereas the South Asian region has the highest number of child malnutrition in any region. You talk about the building of the soft development and human development. Yes, we also support that. And very important, what you have mentioned, people-to-people contacts in these countries. we should build this forum. I think we are trying to provide that kind of platform for that kind of discussion. That was very interesting points we have noted, and we will come back to you again during our question. Let me go to our next speaker. That is Dr. Sabah Gul Khadak. She holds a PhD in political science and a master in international relations. She's an independent researcher. She has worked as country director of the Open Society Foundation in Pakistan. She was a former member of the Planning Commission of Pakistan and an executive director of the Sustainable Development Policy Institute, Islamabad. Her research and policy work focuses on the intersection of gender, governance, structural and direct violence, development and human rights. She serves on several national and regional advisory bodies. We would like to request Mrs. Sabah Gul Khadak. Floor is yours, madam.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rathor. I wanted to talk about two aspects. Or two levels at which I want to address the issues around women and gender, and then the challenges of COVID. Was requested also to address the issue of violence. So I wanted to start with the fact that women were among the first groups to mentally cross the nation-state boundaries to form a collective consciousness in South Asia, as South Asian women. We were talking about identity as South Asians, and I think women are among the first. The question, they question the edifice of the state and the perpetuation of internal violence, as well as the unaccounted impact of militarization upon women and marginalized communities. They're cognizant of the oppressive regimes within which they live, whether under military or democratic dispensations, and they've challenged the efficacy of economic policies that reinforce gender inequalities at the national and regional levels. In recent history, the rape and abduction of women during the partition of India and later the 1971 creation of Bangladesh have been one of the greatest yet virtually silenced traumas suffered by South Asian women. And if I may add, post 9/11 Afghanistan, and in fact, even before that, women in Afghanistan have also experienced a lot of violence, whether as refugees or as women who were living there, who've had to face different kinds of oppressive regimes. So to me, I would add 9/11 also as a huge marker in South Asia in the context of violence. Violence, usually we think about violence that is perpetuated at the level of a community or within the family or so on. But, I wanted to bring up the huge issues of violence that women have faced across South Asia. And also wanted to point out that these are not new issues. There was a declaration that all feminists from South Asia got together in 1989, and it is called the Feminist Declaration. 1989, it was in Bangalore, and you can find it on the net. It is fairly detailed, and even if you read it today, it feels very, very current. And I can just read out one paragraph from it, which you will find resonates. Over the past decades, and this is in 1989 that they are writing, over the past decades, strong social movements have emerged in our countries, resisting and struggling against these manifestations of class and patriarchal rule. One of the most important movements of challenge and resistance to various systems of exploitation and oppression that exist in South Asia has been the women's movement. At both material and ideological levels, feminists of the region have been active in challenging the authoritarianism and violence of the state, its repressive laws, fundamentalist tendencies, militarism, and chauvinism. They have challenged the economic exploitation of workers and peasants, social oppression through the use of religion, culture, and the caste system, as well as discrimination based on ethnicity, language, caste, or religious allegiance. They have also highlighted the use of violence against women within the family and in the workplace. In recent years, they have raised the issue of human rights violations. Apart from such challenges, feminists have also been involved in resistance to all forms of patriarchy, a resistance that has historical roots but also been sharpened in recent decades. There is extensive work which has now been published, whether on the partition of 1947 or 1971, and also extensive work now post 9/11 on the kinds of violence that women have experienced, as well as silencing. Um, so within this larger context, where are we at today? There is some good news, I feel, because the work of feminists across the region, there's so many solidarities. And just as an example, I will quote a recent meeting of feminists across South Asia on 25th March, which for Bangladesh is an important day to celebrate and also remember 1971, where feminists in solidarity with one another questioned what had happened then, but many also questioned what is happening today and whether the liberation that was promised to them has actually been, turned out to be what it was promised to be. So the structural kinds of discrimination, of poverty and inequality that women experienced, whether pre-47 or post 71, continues to exist in their daily lives. And as one author said, that is a different kind of violence when you do not have enough to eat, when you do not have enough to feed your children. That violence kills the soul. And I think it takes feminists to point these issues out and to cross the narrow boundaries of nationalism. And in that context, I do want to emphasize that the women's movement is extremely strong. So while we do question where is hope in South Asia to have its own regional identity, I think women at least have succeeded in having a South Asian identity where they are able to cross these lines that are drawn by our political elite, as Kishore Saab said, or others. In South Asia, 37% women experience violence within the home. This is across South Asia, but the good news is 90% countries have legislation that addresses violence against women. I have to also, I was reminded a lot about the South Asian University that Kishore Saab said has gone nowhere. It was originally envisaged by a bunch of researchers at the Regional Center for RCSS, Strategic Studies in Colombo, where it was envisaged to be a university that would move from one country to another, from one center to another, and it would not have permanent physical, presence in any country, because we felt, I was part of that group, and we had felt that this should be something where people, and this was back in the 90s when things were opening up. However, history turned out to be different, but there's another university, a South Asian Women's University, which is working far more effectively. So what I'm trying to point out is the presence of small areas of hope that continue to exist. For the European Union, yes, it is something that has a larger identity. But if you look at history, in 1873, I think the Triple Entente was formed. So it's taken probably more than a century for them to come to that realization today, to have a more effective European Union, just like the League of Nations and the United Nations have their own histories. So I think we need to take longer kind of chunks of history and then look back, rather than be pulled down by what is happening today. And yes, in South Asia, what is happening today has been happening for the last so many years that one does tend to question where it is headed. But I would think that on some areas there is forward movement across the region. In terms of, I was also asked to address COVID and the challenges of COVID. And once again, yes, the challenges pertain to the same issues of gender identities. So what happens is there is increased violence against women at the level of the home or the family. There are more marriages, underage marriages that have been reported. There is a spike actually in reporting of child abuse. And COVID, of course, has put a damper on response mechanisms. So emergency services, which could be utilized, have been busy dealing with the pandemic. Other kinds of the economic stress that countries have gone under also prevent many services from being very effective. So the health system is not able to provide the kind of services that women under situations of violence would need. Shelters have not been very, very effective, and also as spaces where people need to be put apart. We don't have those kinds of arrangements, effective arrangements. Our shelters will house many, many women at one time. So those are the kind of practical issues. And then there is, of course, the issue of unpaid care work. There are larger issues of more informal sector home-based work for women. So more women are forced into home-based work. There are new entrants into the informal sector. And, So what do we need to do? I can go on and on with a list, but I think what is important is to look at social protection mechanisms, which most South Asian states have emphasized in the COVID context. There are labor organizations that are looking at labor rights, that are trying to unionize even under these circumstances to ensure social security reaches, whether that is SABA in India or other similar organizations, HomeNet, South Asia, HomeNet, Pakistan, others who are prioritizing and helping women access social protection. So, and I think that the most important thing would be to ensure that women are equally represented in any response strategies and planning and decision making with regard to COVID-19 responses. That is something that women across the region are pushing, and that will make sense and will help us move forward. Thank you very much.
Mr. Rathor, you are unmuted. Please unmute yourself.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Khadak. You mentioned a lot of points here: violence against women during the COVID, especially also the child abuse, discrimination, You mentioned also law exists in 90% of the cases to protect that. However, we see a little implementation, and I think this is more important. At the end, you end up with a good hope, with a good note that hope is there, that people are helping each other. Yes, that is a positive note. I will just like to go back, if Dr. Swoboda is still here, a question to him, probably start with the second part of my questions. Dr. Swoboda, Dr. Heinz Geithner, sorry, are you still here?
I'm here.
Okay. Yes. Okay. We start with a few questions. My first question to you is, how do you see the arms race in the South Asian country could be reduced? What do you see any kind of hope here in the next 10, 15 years, or this arms race will continue? As I just mentioned, that approximately $100 billion is spent by these 8 countries on their so-called defense.
Let me give you an unusual response to your question. I'm supervising many doctoral students for years, and they're sitting side by side. They're coming from Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Iran. So, and when I spoke of anarchic-free areas in the region, so all the students work how or explore what kind of anarchic-free areas, which means cooperative regimes, multilateral cooperative assessments and activities in the region are possible. I draw a lot of the ideas of their work. I want to thank my doctoral students, but most importantly, I see that they can communicate with each other. So they're coming all from all countries and look for potential future solutions in a conflict-prone area. So I mentioned some examples where they're working on. These are confidence-building measures. That is, one student is working on a regime on nuclear trafficking. She sees a high potential that India and Pakistan can work in this area. Others, we leave out at the moment. Of course, we discuss it, the nuclear deterrence issue, but that immediately leads to conflict. But there are many areas beneath this nuclear issue where cooperation is possible. Also, notification and military exercises, which was possible in Europe as well. And it was the height of the Cold War. Helsinki was the height of the Cold War, and the document was possible. I can imagine that such a document would be possible for South Asia, including West Asia as well. So the GCPA is possible. So it addresses the nuclear issue. So these are very optimistic and scenarios, possibilities we can learn from. So I'm not entirely pessimistic. I see conflicts can prevail. That's possible. I was speaking about polarization on the world stage, but polarization can increase, as you coming from South Asia know much better than I do. Polarization can happen on a regional level, but the opposite can happen as well, creating security communities, cooperative regimes, anarchic-free areas. That's possible, and my students demonstrate this every week in my class.
Thank you very much, Dr. Heinz Geithner. Because the time is limited, I just go to Mr. Kishore Mandhyan. The question is, what impact do you foresee in the region from Gandhi's secular India to Modi's Hindu national state? And another, in this context also, as our ex-UN colleague and also long-term peacekeeper, what role could international organizations such as United Nations can play in resolving the issues among the South Asian countries, especially when it comes to solution found in Kashmir issue between Pakistan and India? You have to unmute, please.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. There are two questions here. One is, what role for international institutions such as the UN in resolving disputes, particularly border disputes in South Asia, which is one of the pointers that you had actually written to me about, and I had made notes on it, but I forgot to mention it, so I'll address that. And the second is, could you please repeat it? The second question was about what hope do you see?
The second question was, what impact do you foresee in the region from Gandhi's secular India to Modi's Hindu nationalist state in this region? I mean,
right. So let me first take the UN issue. Look, the United Nations conducts itself on the basis of a charter, and arenas in which it has engaged on the basis of the Charter and UN Security Council resolutions. My sense is that it has a limited role in border disputes. There are some border disputes where its role has been helpful. There are other border disputes where its role has not amounted to much. If you look at relatively weak states in hostile situations, there are some good examples where the UN has been a relatively strong facilitator. If you look at the Eritrea-Ethiopia demarcation, that's one particular example. If you look at the Iraq-Kuwait delineation, which I was involved with while I was in Iraq with Ashraf Qazi, a wonderful diplomat from your own country. That's another example where we were relatively successful as the United Nations Assistance Mission. In Croatia, I was personally engaged in two exercises. One on the transfer of, Eastern Slavonia from Serbia or Serbian control to Croatia in the United Nations Transitional Administration in Eastern Slavonia. And the other one was a transfer from Serbia, Montenegro, the Prevlaka Peninsula, back to Croatia. So I think these are some real examples where the UN has played a role. But these were relatively weak states with strong proxies, with strong inducements, and in which there was unanimity of consent, but not entirely, but there was a critical mass of consent at the international level, at the regional level, and by and large, I think to some extent it was pushed at the local levels in each of the countries that were involved. I don't think those conditions exist in South Asia, because the states are relatively, I underscore that, stronger, more robust. They're not in a full conflict situation. They don't really have proxies such as Europe or the United States of America. And they will resist those kinds of proxies. So I think it will be more difficult. And I think the role that the United Nations has tried to play will be resisted in India quite a lot, as you well know. So I don't see it happening. Now, there are border disputes between other countries and India. There are questions of sharing of waters. My sense is that we have to build constituencies for settling our problems ourselves. We have to move away. And I'm not trying to speak the standard Indian line of bilateralism. I'm trying to come from a slightly different angle, that if we have to have sustainable solutions, they must come from within. They cannot come from and must not come from outside. If you look at the history of settlement of disputes and conflict resolution over the last 75 years, or you even go before that to the League of Nations, durable solutions come from within, from stable polities, with political elites which arrive at a consensus, and there is a different paradigm that the countries are seeking. Unfortunately, South Asia, apart from the wonderful examples given by Sabah Khadak, is locked in the old paradigm. And unfortunately, it is being stretched deeper and further into the old paradigm. If you look at what is happening in the last few years, both within the countries and their responses to external inducements, whether we have a very severe situation in Myanmar, we have a very uncertain situation in Afghanistan, we have the Tamil Ilam issue in Sri Lanka. We have our own issues in 165 districts where the central government cannot really properly govern, where there are Maoists, okay, apart from Kashmir and the Northeast. So we are states in the making. We are not mature states. You rightly mentioned, Sabah, that we are in a very peculiar, absurd situation where our industrialization is late, but we are taking postmodern or modern institutions and trying to marry them into a situation which Europe went through in the 19th century. So we have some contradictions over there. We have to intellectualize these issues much more clearly so we can come to a proper analysis. It is not the mechanical adaptation of particular forms or mandates. You know, because they exist, we can apply them. I think we have to self-reflect. The other question that you asked is a very interesting question, and it's related to what I've said so far. Look, I was out of the country for 30 to 40 years. I kept coming and going.
You don't want to see this?
I kept coming and going. And I think I know my country pretty well. I speak 4 to 5 languages, but I was involved in 12 to 13 UN missions across the world. And having come back 4 to 5 years ago, joined a political party, got into the belly of the beast, and our political party is fighting the Congress and the BJP because they are a political nexus, they are a political mafia. Okay. And we are fighting them because we have come to realize that our elites are, in a sense, captive into this nexus. But, you know, recently we won the Aam Aadmi Party elections on the ground in Maharashtra, 130 seats out of several thousand in the local elections at the ground level. We drove to meet these people. And it was amazing to see 25-year-olds, 26-year-olds, I wish I could share the stories with you, that they were concerned about roti, kapda, makan, food, clothing, shelter. They didn't know what South Asia is. They don't even know what ideology means. And they are the millions of India who are on the ground. And the conditions in which they live, because we fly across capitals, but we never drive to capitals. Even when I came to Pakistan, a lot of people said, Kishore, why are you driving around Sindh and Balochistan? Why are you driving around Punjab? I said, I want to see the ground. And they said, no, you can easily fly, you will save time. And I think elites all across South Asia are flying over their countries rather than going through their countries. So they don't see the pain. They don't hear the woman who's carrying, you know, water for 3 kilometers while she has a mobile in her hand. It's a contradiction to have a mobile in your hand and actually fetch water 3 kilometers away. So what I see on the ground is an extremely smart, empowered, young set of people coming up. The only fear is that they shouldn't get co-opted or they shouldn't be disenfranchised by the political inequality and a surveillance state which is likely to emerge in many countries if we don't ensure our fundamental human rights very strongly. And then you have the political elite on the top, completely oblivious, barring a few sterling exceptions, of what is happening on the ground. And in between, you have an intermediary, what I call dalal class, at every level, in the highest bureaucracy, in the middle bureaucracy, and even in the petty bureaucracy. And basically, you can buy them. You can literally buy them. I'm sure you can buy them in any one of our countries. So we have a very fragile state. We should not assume that these are mature states. There is a lot of hope on the ground. Those people live with great expectations. But I must say the challenges are deep. And we have to go on the right side of history. We have to move to the right side of history. We cannot continue with the same political class of which we are a part right now. But that's a deeper discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kishore Mandhyan. It was quite comprehensive. Yes, you have mentioned there is also a lot of opportunities if we start talking about the trade. For example, currently the trade volume among these 8 countries approximately less than $30 billion, which they could easily be increased to $170 billion. I mean, the potential is there. However, we need to talk. We need to have more people-to-people contacts. I go to Mrs. Khadak, and I have a very also question about the future. Mrs. Khadak, do you see any improvement in the next 10 to 15 years in the role of women in South Asian region? And what could be done to improve their living standard?
Women, yes, I see a lot of hope and a lot of good things happening. If you look at just Bangladesh, take that example and take it from 1971 and look at just the indices. Women in Bangladesh today are doing much better than they would have had they continued to be part of Pakistan. But overall, like you yourself had pointed out, overall on the different human development indices and so on, there are improvements. And for women, definitely there are improvements, whether it's, for example, in Pakistan, women have achieved parity at the higher education level. And in fact, there are perhaps in some places more women in universities than there are men, both as students as well as teachers. So yes, for women, I see a lot of good stuff happening. Overall on South Asia, yes, I share Kishore Saab's reservations. I do think there is a larger wave of very neoliberal politics, of very nasty kinds of nationalisms that are emerging. But at the same time, I don't know, I continue to see I cling to those islands of hope and try not to think the 2 nuclear states, yes, the politics between the 2 of them instead of improving, which is something we thought, and I think we need to connect that with the larger context of world politics. Somehow the Cold War ended, but for us in South Asia, the Cold War continues. And, in the 90s only, we thought things would get better, and I thought things would continue to get better, except they reversed. So it's 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Having said that, we can't give up on our region. We have to continue to work for more people-to-people dialogues, for more interactions such as the one today. This is something we have all strived for, and that is why there is a South Asian identity, even if it is in small islands within South Asia. Thank you. Oh, one postscript. I agree entirely. Laws may be there, but implementation is an issue. Once again, we are pushing for implementation. There are small successes here and there. For example, in India on the issue of rape, that's huge successes over there. But also in Pakistan, in the Sindh province, there is actually a more comprehensive approach, and in Bangladesh again. So there are some pushes, but the legal system, of course, will resist. It's the slowest to change. It resists change. So yes, I agree. Implementation continues to be an issue. We have to keep pushing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khadak. We have still a lot of questions, but I see we are running out of the time. Therefore, I apologize to all our audience that we will not be able to take all the questions which they have put in the chat and in question answer session. At the end, I just would like to take this opportunity on behalf of International Institute for Peace, myself, to thank all of you for your engagement in the process. I look forward to continue and expand our cooperation and collaboration in the future, and will engage to work for achieving a better tomorrow for our next generation. I close the webinar and will hand over to Dr. Heinz Geithner, but before that, I always quote Martin Luther King Jr., who says, "Peace cannot be kept by force. It can only be achieved by understanding. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." And Nelson Mandela once said, a leader, and that was where I in the beginning say, leadership should have a long-term vision and courage to taking unpopular decision. A real leader uses every issue, no matter how serious and sensitive it is, to ensure that at the end of the debate, we should emerge stronger and more united than before. And I think this is the message we should take that and go forward. On behalf of that, I would like to thank everybody, Mrs. Khatak, Mr. Kishore, MANDHYAN, Dr. Hans Svoboda, Stephanie, Heinz Gärtner, and the previous panelists. Thank you very much, and I hand over to Dr. Heinz Gärtner. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I don't have much to add. I'm very grateful for this very rich discussion, and it showed that it's possible to communicate. And I want to thank also the International Institute for Peace and all the panelists. And I have to mention also, again, I will thank Yasir Khan, who had the idea. And I have to mention that he is also a doctoral student of mine. So students can do a lot, and I'm looking forward for to the next generation that can do much better.